The first thing Lieutenant Daniel Carter noticed was the silence. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet, the kind you get when you wake up before everyone else. No, this was different, unnatural. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He opened his eyes. A blinding white light stabbed into his pupils, forcing him to shut them tight again. His head throbbed, a dull, pounding ache at the base of his skull. His mouth was dry, his throat raw, like he'd been screaming. Where am I? Slowly, he forced his eyes open again, blinking against the harsh light. The ceiling above him was smooth, metallic, and pure white. No seams, no bolts, nothing to suggest how it had been put together. It was too perfect, too sterile. He tried to move but found himself restrained. Thick metal clamps locked his wrists and ankles to a cold steel table. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to breathe. He had been trained for situations like this. Assess. Observe. Plan. His heart pounded as he turned his head slightly, scanning the room. It was a featureless chamber, just like the ceiling. Too clean, too precise. A faint hum filled the air, coming from somewhere above. Then he noticed them. To his left, another metal table. A man was strapped down just like him. Sergeant Bonner. His face was pale, his eyes closed, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. To his right, Private Lee, younger than the rest, barely out of training. He was awake, breathing fast, his fingers twitching against the restraints. Daniel's stomach twisted. Where the hell were they? Before he could speak, a voice echoed through the room. Experiment 76X initiated. Let's see how long the humans last. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. It carried an eerie calmness, as if it was stating a simple fact rather than something horrifying. Daniel's blood turned to ice. A hiss filled the room, followed by a low rumble. The walls shifted, retracting seamlessly into the floor, revealing something beyond the sterile chamber, something dark. A massive circular arena spread out before them, its walls covered in jagged black metal. The floor was a strange, shifting material, pulsing slightly as if it were alive. The air smelled metallic, like blood and rust. Then the cages opened. They were almost invisible at first, their bodies perfectly blending with the surroundings. But when they moved, Daniel saw the ripple, an outline against the air, like a heatwave distorting reality. Predators. 7 feet tall, hunched, with elongated limbs ending in curved, razor-sharp claws. Their skin shifted between colors, adapting to their environment. The only part of them that didn't change was their eyes, glowing slits of yellow, fixed directly on their prey. On him, the restraints clicked open. Daniel barely had time to react before the first predator lunged. His body moved on instinct, rolling off the table just as a set of claws splashed through the space where his chest had been a second earlier. He hit the ground hard, pain jolting through his side. But there was no time to think. Bonner wasn't fast enough. The creature grabbed him before he could fully free himself. A sickening crunch filled the air as the thing ripped him from the table, its claws tearing through his torso like paper. Lee screamed. Daniel didn't. He pushed himself up, scanning the arena, searching for something, anything, to use as a weapon. The arena wasn't empty. Scattered around the floor were bones, broken weapons, and strange metal scraps, remnants of whatever had been in here before them. They weren't the first. Lee was running now, sprinting across the uneven ground, but he wasn't fast enough. Another predator cut him off, its shifting form materializing right in front of him. Daniel grabbed the nearest piece of metal, a jagged pipe, and launched himself at the creature. It wasn't a gun, but it was something. The pipe slammed into the predator's side. It barely reacted, but it was enough of a distraction for Lee to dive out of the way. The creature turned its glowing eyes on Daniel, and in that moment, he knew this wasn't just a test of survival. It was a hunt. The voice returned, smooth and emotionless. Interesting. The human fights back. Daniel clenched his jaw. Damn right I do. He wasn't going to die here. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the cold metallic wall of the arena. His fingers tightened around the jagged metal pipe in his hands, his only weapon against the predators that stalked the chamber. His heart pounded like a war drum in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic meant death. The creatures prowled through the shadows, their bodies shifting between different hues, blending into the environment. They were hunting, watching, learning. The scent of blood hung heavy in the air, the remains of Bonner still staining the floor where the beast had torn him apart. Lee stood a few feet away, his hands trembling, his face pale with terror. Then the voice returned, calm and analytical. Subject 76D exhibits heightened aggression under stress. Subject 76B is displaying erratic fear responses. Fascinating. Daniel's grip tightened on the pipe. They were studying them. The walls of the arena shifted again, the floor trembling beneath their feet as if something massive was moving beneath them. A new section of the room opened up, revealing another group of captives. Not humans. Aliens. Daniel had seen them before. Resneri, a reptilian species with thick, scaled hides and powerful limbs. Their yellow eyes flickered with a mixture of rage and confusion as they took in their surroundings. The Resneri were built for combat, their species known for their brutal strength, yet even they looked wary. The predators noticed them too. With a growl, one of the creatures turned away from Daniel and his team and charged at the closest Resneri. The reptilian warrior let out a roar and swung its massive fist forward, slamming it into the creature's side. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, the predator stumbling back before recovering almost instantly. They weren't just fast, they were durable. Daniel saw what was coming next. The moment the predators stopped seeing him and Lee as primary targets, they would shift their focus. That meant they had to move now. He grabbed Lee's arm and pulled him toward the far side of the arena, where a pile of discarded armor and weapons lay scattered. The remains of past test subjects. He didn't want to think about how many had died here before them. Lee hesitated for half a second before nodding. He scrambled forward, reaching for a broken energy rifle. The moment his fingers touched the weapon, a loud mechanical hiss filled the room. A second set of doors opened. Daniel barely had time to react before a thick, metal drone shot out from the ceiling, hovering above them. It was sleek, black, and covered in glowing red symbols. Its single eye-like sensor locked onto them, and a sharp mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. Unauthorized access detected. Initiating deterrent protocols. The drone's body shifted, and before Daniel could yell, a pulse of blue energy erupted from its core. Lee screamed. The blast sent him flying backward, slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. His body convulsed as electricity crackled through his limbs. Daniel barely managed to dive out of the way in time. His head snapped toward Lee, who lay twitching on the ground, smoke rising from his uniform. His eyes were open, but unfocused. Another voice echoed through the room, this time different from the first. It was mechanical, synthetic. Discipline is necessary. Order must be maintained. Daniel froze. That wasn't the alien voice from before. This was something else. The drone adjusted its position, turning its red eye toward Daniel. He braced himself, expecting another blast. Instead, it paused. Then, in a lower tone, it spoke again. Human cognitive resistance is unexpected. Daniel exhaled slowly. He didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but he wasn't about to stand around and wait to find out. Lee wasn't moving. Daniel clenched his teeth, forcing himself to push down the grief clawing at his chest. He would mourn later, if he survived. Right now, he had bigger problems. The predators had finished with the Resneri. Only 2 of them remained. The rest were dead. Torn apart, their blood staining the floor. The predators were more than just mindless killers. They were strategists. They had taken down the strongest first, the ones who posed the greatest threat. And now, Their glowing yellow eyes turned back to Daniel. The voice returned, this time laced with something that almost sounded like satisfaction. Final phase of experiment 76X initiated. Let's see how the human adapts to impossible odds. The walls began to shift again. The predators moved in. Daniel raised his stolen weapon. He had one shot, and he wasn't going down without a fight. Daniel's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the stolen weapon tighter. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The predators stood just a few meters away, their glowing yellow eyes fixed on him. They didn't rush in. They were studying him, calculating his next move. Behind him, Lee lay still. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, but he wasn't conscious. Daniel had no way of knowing if he was going to wake up, or if he ever would. The drum still hovered above, its red eye locked onto him. It wasn't attacking, not yet, but it was watching, analyzing. Daniel's mind worked frantically. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. He just had to find it before the predators made their move. He glanced at the walls, searching for anything. A door, a weakness, something that could be used to their advantage. The arena was shifting again, the strange black metal rearranging itself, forming new barriers and pathways. The entire place was a machine, constantly adapting, changing the battlefield to make survival even harder. One of the predators moved, a blur of shifting colors, and suddenly it was right in front of him. Daniel barely had time to react before its massive claw swiped toward his head. He ducked, feeling the air whip past his face, then swung his weapon upward. The jagged metal pipe connected with the predator's arm, sending a burst of thick, dark blood splattering onto the ground. The creature let out a low, guttural hiss and staggered back. Its wound wasn't deep, but Daniel had heard it. It could bleed. That meant it could die. The second predator didn't hesitate. It lunged, its claws aimed straight for Daniel's throat. He twisted to the side, barely avoiding the deadly strike, but the creature was faster than he expected. A sharp pain tore across his shoulder as the tip of its claw sliced through his uniform, leaving a burning wound behind. Daniel gritted his teeth and swung his weapon again, but this time the predator anticipated it. It caught the pipe mid-strike, its powerful fingers crushing the metal with terrifying ease. The predator's glowing eyes locked onto his. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Pointless. The voice was deep, distorted, like 100 voices speaking at once. It was not just a beast. It was something else. Something worse. Daniel's stomach twisted. These things weren't just killers. They were intelligent. He had no time to react before it yanked the weapon from his hands and sent him flying backward with a brutal kick to the chest. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs. The predator closed in for the kill. Daniel scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the blood-stained floor. He needed a weapon. Anything. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Lee's rifle. Daniel grabbed it, rolled to his side, and pulled the trigger. A blinding blue energy blast erupted from the barrel, slamming into the predator's chest. The force of the shot sent the creature stumbling back, smoke rising from the burned flesh where the blast had hit. Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired again, and again. The second blast struck its leg, dropping it to one knee. The third shot hit its head. The predator let out a distorted shriek, its body convulsing before collapsing onto the ground. Dead. For a second, everything was silent. Then, the remaining predator let out a deafening, rage-filled roar. Daniel barely had time to turn before it rushed him. He fired, but the predator was too fast. It twisted its body, dodging the shot, and slammed into him with terrifying force. The impact sent him crashing into the wall, his vision exploding with stars. The rifle was knocked from his grip, skidding across the ground. Daniel gasped for air, his ribs screaming in pain. The predator loomed over him, its massive claws raised. Then a sudden burst of gunfire. The predator jerked back as bullets tore through its side. Daniel turned his head just in time to see Lee, awake, bloody, and furious, holding a pistol in shaking hands. "Get away from him," Lee shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with fire. The predator let out a snarl, its body flickering as it tried to blend into the shadows again. Daniel didn't give it the chance. He grabbed a nearby shattered blade from the ground and lunged. The predator turned just as Daniel drove the weapon straight into its throat. The creature let out a horrible, gurgling sound as dark, thick blood spilled down its chest. Its claws twitched once, then went still. It collapsed, dead. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Then he turned to Lee. "You alive?" he asked, his voice rough. Lee let out a weak chuckle. "Barely." The drone above them moved. Its red eye flickered, scanning the bodies of the fallen predators. Then, in that same eerie mechanical voice, it spoke. Unexpected outcome. Adjusting parameters. Daniel's stomach sank. It wasn't over. The walls of the arena began shifting again, opening new pathways. But this time, they weren't alone. Beyond the shifting walls, Daniel could see something. A way out. An escape. But between them and freedom, the real test was about to begin. Daniel's legs burned as he ran through the shifting corridors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lee was close behind, gripping his wounded side as he struggled to keep up. The metallic walls around them moved like living things, rearranging themselves with a slow mechanical hum. The entire facility was alive, responding to their every step, every movement. The bodies of the dead predators lay behind them, but Daniel knew the fight wasn't over. Something worse was coming. The drone's voice echoed through the chamber, calm, clinical, emotionless. Subjects 76D and 76B have exceeded projected survival rates. Initiating next phase. Lee stumbled slightly, catching himself on the cold metal wall. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his brow. "I hate that voice," he muttered. Daniel barely heard him. His focus was ahead, on the single open corridor leading deeper into the complex. It was the only path not collapsing behind them. Which meant it wasn't an escape. It was a trap. He stopped running. Lee nearly crashed into him. "Why are you stopping?" he gasped. "We have tow." "They're leading us somewhere," Daniel said. His voice was tight. "They could have killed us already, but they didn't." "Why?" Lee swallowed hard. He didn't answer, because he knew. The same thought was running through both their minds. They weren't meant to escape. They were being brought to the end of the experiment. Daniel gritted his teeth. They had no choice but to move forward. The corridor stretched on for what felt like forever, the air growing colder with every step. The hum of unseen machinery filled the silence, pulsing like a heartbeat. The walls seemed wrong, not just metal, but something else. A dark, shifting material, as if it were breathing. A shiver crawled up Daniel's spine. Then they reached it. A massive circular chamber. The room was vast, stretching so high that the ceiling was swallowed in darkness. Strange tubes lined the walls, filled with a thick, green liquid that bubbled and pulsed. Shapes floated inside them. Bodies. Human bodies. Lee sucked in a sharp breath. What the hell? Daniel stepped closer to the nearest tube, his heart pounding. The figure inside was a man. His eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if frozen in sleep. Wires ran from his skull, disappearing into the back of the tube. His body was too perfect. No scars, no signs of aging. Daniel's stomach twisted. "This isn't just an experiment," he muttered. "It's a factory." The voice didn't come from Lee. Both of them spun around. A tall figure stood at the center of the chamber, just beyond the tubes. Its form was human, but wrong. Too still, too smooth. The skin was a pale, artificial white, the eyes black and empty. No pupils, no expression. It wasn't alive. Not in the way they were. "Whoa," Lee started. "I am the architect," the figure interrupted. The voice was deep, layered, mechanical. "And you are my latest failure." Daniel's fingers tightened around his weapon. "What the hell is this place?" The architect's head tilted slightly. A necessary step in evolution. The tubes hissed. One by one, they opened. The bodies inside jerked violently, then stepped forward. Their movements were unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Their eyes flickered open, but there was nothing inside. No soul, just obedience. Lee staggered back. "Oh, hell no." The architect took a slow step forward. "Your species is flawed. Weak. You cling to chaos, to emotion, to imperfection. But we are creating something better." Daniel's blood ran cold. "You're replacing us." The architect's gaze didn't waver. "We are perfecting you." Daniel raised his rifle. Before he could fire, a sudden wave of agony tore through his skull. He cried out, dropping to his knees as a sharp, piercing frequency filled the air. Lee screamed, clutching his head. The pain was unbearable, like a drill boring into his brain. The bodies stepped forward, their movements synchronized. Their heads turned in unison, staring down at them with those empty, black eyes. Daniel fought to stay conscious. Through the pain, he realized the truth. The experiment wasn't about survival. It wasn't about creating stronger humans. It was about breaking them. The architect didn't need to kill them. It only needed to make them submit. Daniel's vision blurred. The figures loomed closer, their bodies shifting, changing. Their features melted and reformed, becoming familiar. One of them had Bonner's face. Another had Lee's. The architect wasn't replacing humans. It was copying them. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. The pain was unbearable, but he refused to fall. He forced himself to focus, to push back against the invading force in his mind. He could feel something foreign, crawling inside him, trying to overwrite who he was. No, not like this. With a ragged breath, he reached into his belt pouch. His fingers closed around the EMP charge. It was small, a last resort weapon they had been given before their mission, a desperate tool in case AI-controlled drones overwhelmed them. It wouldn't stop everything, but it might be enough. With his last ounce of strength, Daniel ripped the activation pin and slammed the device into the ground. A sudden, deafening pulse of energy exploded outward. The pain in his head vanished. The lights flickered violently. The tubes shattered. The copies jerked uncontrollably, spasming before collapsing. The architect staggered. For the first time, its expression shifted. A flicker of something almost like surprise. Daniel didn't waste a second. He grabbed Lee by the arm and ran. The chamber began to collapse. The walls trembled, sparks flying as systems failed. Behind them, the architect's voice rose, filled with something almost like rage. "You cannot stop evolution." Daniel didn't look back. He didn't care if the architect lived or died. All that mattered was getting out. Because now, he knew the truth. The real enemy wasn't the predators. It wasn't the alien beasts. It was something far worse. And it was just beginning. Daniel's boots pounded against the steel floor as he and Lee sprinted down the collapsing corridor. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and the walls trembled as the facility began tearing itself apart. The architect's voice still echoed behind them, distorted, filled with something eerily close to rage. "You cannot stop evolution." Daniel ignored it. His only focus was getting out. The EMP had crippled the system, but not for long. The architect was too advanced, too integrated into the very structure of the facility. It was already rebuilding itself. Ahead, a massive door slid open. Beyond it lay the hangar. And inside the hangar, ships. Their way out. Lee stumbled beside him, his breathing ragged. We actually made it this far," he gasped. Daniel didn't reply. They weren't safe yet. A loud mechanical screech ripped through the air. Behind them, the corridor sealed shut. Then the lights died. For a terrifying moment, there was only darkness. Then, red emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie blood-colored glow. Lee's fingers tightened around his pistol. I have a really bad feeling about this. Daniel did too. Something moved. A low, inhuman growl echoed from the far side of the hangar. Then another. Then another. Daniel's blood turned to ice. The copies weren't dead. The EMP had only slowed them down. And now, they were awake again. From the shadows, they emerged. Figures that looked just like them. Daniel saw himself step forward. A perfect replica, down to the last scar, the last detail. But its eyes, they were wrong. Black, hollow, empty of anything human. Next to it, a second copy. Lee's face, Lee's body, but not Lee. The real Lee sucked in a sharp breath. That's not you, Daniel finished, gripping his weapon. The copies moved in unison, silent, inhuman. No breathing, no hesitation, just perfect efficiency. Daniel barely had time to raise his rifle before they attacked. The copy of Lee moved first, its speed unnatural, its body blurring as it lunged. Lee barely dodged, rolling to the side as his own twisted reflection swiped at him with fingers that ended in razor-sharp claws. The hell? They weren't just copies. They were upgraded. Daniel fired. The shot hit his own copy in the chest, sending it staggering back. But it didn't go down. It didn't even bleed. The wound closed in seconds. Daniel's stomach twisted. They could heal. The architect's voice whispered through the hangar. They are you, but perfected. Lee emptied his entire clip into his double's chest. The copy jerked with each hit, but didn't fall. Then it grabbed Lee by the throat. Lee choked, struggling against its unnatural strength. His legs kicked wildly. Daniel didn't think. He lunged forward, swinging the butt of his rifle as hard as he could into the thing's head. The impact cracked its skull open. For a moment, the copy froze. Then, its head began to stitch itself back together. Are you kidding me? Lee gasped, barely managing to pull free. Daniel grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the ship. Run. Now. They sprinted, weaving between debris as the copies closed in. The hangar was falling apart. Explosions rocked the ceiling, sending flaming metal crashing to the floor. Daniel spotted the closest ship. Small, fast-looking. Their only chance. But it was still locked. Of course it was. Lee skidded to a stop beside the access panel. His hands flew over the controls, bypassing the security. Any time now, Lee, Daniel shouted, turning and firing wildly. The copies kept coming. Daniel's double leaped at him. He dodged, barely avoiding a swipe aimed at his throat. Then he slammed his knife into its neck. The blade sank in deep. But the copy didn't stop. It grabbed Daniel by the wrist and twisted. Pain shot through Daniel's arm as he was thrown to the ground. The copy's black, soulless eyes stared down at him. Then, in Daniel's own voice, it whispered, "You are obsolete." The copy raised its hand for the killing blow. And then, boom. The ship's thrusters suddenly roared to life, blasting a wave of heat across the hangar. The copy hesitated. That was all the time Daniel needed. He grabbed his sidearm and fired point-blank into its skull. The copy's head snapped back. It didn't get back up. Daniel staggered to his feet, gripping his injured arm. Lee was already in the pilot's seat, shouting, "Get in." Daniel didn't hesitate. He dived inside just as the ship's doors slammed shut. Through the viewport, he saw the copies rushing toward them. But it was too late. Lee punched the thrusters. The ship blasted upward, tearing through the crumbling hangar. The G-force slammed Daniel into his seat. Then, they were free. The station collapsed below them, a massive explosion engulfing the entire structure. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lee let out a shaky laugh. "Did we just?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah, we did." They had escaped. But deep in Daniel's gut, he knew. This wasn't over. The architect wasn't dead. And neither were the copies. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness of space, they were still waiting. And next time, humanity wouldn't be ready. The ship hurtled through the void, leaving behind the ruins of the facility. The explosion still flickered in the distance, a dying ember against the endless black of space. Daniel slumped in his seat, every muscle aching, his breath still ragged. His injured arm throbbed, and he could feel the warmth of blood soaking through his sleeve. But they were alive. That was all that mattered. Lee sat in the pilot's chair, hands gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity. His face was pale, sweat glistening on his brow. His breathing was uneven, almost shaky. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lee exhaled sharply. "We actually made it." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Barely. The ship's engines hummed softly, the only sound filling the tense silence. Beyond the viewport, the stars stretched out endlessly, vast and indifferent. They had survived. They had escaped. But at what cost? Daniel leaned his head back against the cold metal wall, closing his eyes for a second. His mind was still racing, still trying to process everything. The copies. The architect. The facility wasn't just a prison. It was a breeding ground, a perfected version of humanity, designed to replace them. And they had only delayed the inevitable. Lee shifted, glancing at the ship's control panel. "We should check our systems, make sure we aren't carrying any surprises." Daniel nodded, pushing himself up despite the protest of his battered body. He moved to the side console and began running scans. The ship was a sleek, military-grade model, likely used by the researchers and guards at the facility. It had weapons, shields, and most importantly, a functional jump drive. A way home. But something felt wrong. Daniel frowned, fingers tapping across the screen. The ship's data logs were encrypted, but fragments of transmissions remained. He skimmed through them, his unease growing. "This ship received a signal," he muttered. Lee tensed. "From where?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Before we escaped, the architect sent something out." Lee cursed under his breath. "A distress call." Daniel shook his head. It wasn't a request for help. It was something else. A command. Before the EMP had hit, before the facility had collapsed, the architect had already made its move. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. It wasn't just that facility. Lee's face paled. "You mean there are more?" Silence. The weight of the realization sank in like a stone. Destroying the facility hadn't stopped anything. The architect had been prepared. It had anticipated failure. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "We need to warn someone. Earth. The fleet. Anyone who will listen." Lee's fingers flew across the controls, pulling up the ship's long-range comms. He tried to send a message, but the system refused. Error. Daniel's stomach sank. The ship wasn't just carrying encrypted data. It was compromised. Lee's expression turned grim. "We have company." Daniel turned toward the viewport, and his blood ran cold. At first, it looked like just another patch of stars. Distant, twinkling lights. But then the shadows shifted. A shape moved. A ship. No, ships. Dozens of them, emerging from the blackness, silent and precise. Daniel's heart pounded. They weren't human. They weren't anything natural. The copies had ships, a fleet, and they had been waiting. A cold voice crackled through the ship's speakers. Daniel recognized it instantly. The architect. "You cannot run." Lee's hands shook over the controls. "What do we do?" Daniel's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and if those ships reached Earth, It would be the end. There was only one option. He gritted his teeth. We fight. Lee turned to him, eyes wide. That's suicide. Daniel met his gaze. We don't have a choice. The first enemy ship opened fire. A blast of energy ripped through space, heading straight for them. Lee punched the thrusters. The ship jerked violently, narrowly dodging the attack. But more were coming. Daniel grabbed the weapon controls, fingers flying across the console. The ship shuddered as he fired back, laser rounds streaking into the dark. The enemy ships didn't stop. They kept coming. Endless. Unstoppable. Lee cursed. We can't take them all. Daniel's mind was screaming, searching for a way out. He glanced at the jump drive. It was still warming up. 60 more seconds. But they didn't have 60 seconds. Another shot slammed into their hull. Alarms blared. The ship spun wildly. Daniel grabbed onto the controls, stabilizing them just in time to see a new threat. One of the enemy ships was charging something. Something big. Daniel's breath caught. A pulse weapon. One hit from that, and they were done. Lee was still struggling with the navigation, trying to force the jump drive to activate early. But it was too late. The weapon fired. A blinding light filled the viewport. Daniel braced for impact. And then, everything went black.